It was almost real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 117. Hello and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling from the 1860s to 1930 and probably pretty soon 1940. And in this episode, I'll be discussing Stanislaus Zbyszko winning his first world title in May of 1921. But first, as I had announced a few weeks ago, this week was supposed to be a break for the podcast. We were going to take a break on the second Monday of each month, but I've changed that. I've decided in 2026 I'm going to concentrate on two things. One is going to be trying to write 3 professional wrestling books in the calendar year of 2026. That's a stretch goal. I'm not sure that I'll make it, but I'm going to give it a shot. And the other thing I'm going to focus on is the podcast. So I'm not going to produce any posts other than the ones I have scheduled for Dr. MLK Day, which is next Monday, Memorial Day, and Labor Day. So other than that, you should get an episode from me every single week, maybe with a guest or two, maybe not. We'll have to see. So for the update this week, besides the show update, we discovered through an interview that John Cena did that maybe the fans shouldn't have been booing Triple H out of the building after that Saturday night's main event finish. Maybe the fans should have been booing John Cena out of the building because he may be the one that's responsible for the great idea to tap out to Gunther with that silly smile on his face. I won't go too in depth because I know that's been covered by a lot of podcasts, but John Cena decided that this last match, if we believe what he said in the podcast, and I do, was sort of going to be like the death of his career. So he's in this ferocious hold and he's fighting and he's fighting and he's fighting. And with everything he's got, he's trying to resist. But at the very end, he can no longer resist. And as his career just sort of dies, he reaches up and taps and he has a smile on his face. You know, because of all the good things he's done in his career and all the good times he's had in his career. The problem with that scenario is no one in the world knew that going into that match. So that was the most unsatisfying finish for the fans that I've seen in a long time. The first thing I thought of when I'm watching it in the moment is, why did he tap? They should have just had him pass out. Well, my brother-in-law was over for Christmas Eve, and he's been a fan about as long as I have. He's a month older than I am. And we've watched wrestling together many times. We've gone to live events. He's one of the few people I've been to live events with. I was talking to him about wrestling, and he said, yeah, I'm back to watching it all in about 30 minutes to an hour. Each week I can go through all of the WWF programming and just watch what I'm interested in. And I asked him about the Saturday night's main event, and he just looked over at me and goes, why did he have that stupid grin on his face when he tapped out? So it was totally lost on the people that were watching this match that that's what he was trying to get across. And I think the biggest problem with all of this is when you get wannabe actors, which a lot of wrestlers, particularly in the modern era, are in their heart wannabe actors, who then become real actors. I've seen this with The Rock, and I've seen it with Cena. They think that they're creative because they've been real actors now is so earth-shattering and such a piece of art that they're delivering out there when they're out there performing in front of the fans, that they think every creative idea that they come up with is great. And if you have no way of conveying this, and there was no way to convey what he was trying to convey before it all went on, And obviously nobody got it in the arena as they booed Triple H out of the building because his head of creative, they thought he was responsible for this mess. Just like Triple H took the blame when The Rock stuck his big nose in the WrestleMania this past year and had his creative helped come up with the Cena heel turn, which was a disaster. The only thing that would have been worse than that is if they had turned Cody heel. You see what happens when these actors start to bring forth their art into the art of professional wrestling. So Triple H, if you truly weren't the one that came up with that disaster, I'm sorry that I put the blame on you on the podcast where I talked about it. And I guess the blame has to reside where it should be with John Cena. AEW and White Castle are promoting a combo, which that's a pretty small combo. They should have went for something meatier. And if you're not familiar with White Castle, it's a fast food restaurant here in the United States. I don't think they're anywhere else in the world, but maybe they are by now. But for the long time, I think they were mainly a Midwestern restaurant. We have several in St. Louis. For a long time, my family down in Southeast Missouri didn't have a White Castle. Now they have a White Castle in Cape Girardeau, but they didn't for the longest time. So they would come up, and one of the stops they would make before they would go back home, not on the way back home, because they're called belly bombers for a reason. These hamburgers are famous for attacks on your digestive tract, but they would always want to get White Castles when they came up, which are these small little square hamburgers that have a lot of onions on them. Their fries are actually the best thing they have at this restaurant. But I don't think it's a bad idea for AEW. I think any cross promotion is a good idea. It helps get their brand out there. And it also means they've attracted enough attention that at least some companies are interested in doing some cross promotional work with them. So I think that's a good thing. I just recently finished the Wrestling Observer 1985 yearbook. And the one thing I was impressed upon by that book, or the one thing that book left me with, the impression it left me with, was Vince McMahon did not win the wrestling war because of his wrestling knowledge or the wrestling he was promoting. A lot of times, the wrestling he was promoting was comic book, and a lot of the wrestlers were lazy. But Vince was running it as a business. He would go to conventions where television producers were at, VHS tape sellers conventions. He was putting himself in places where traditionally wrestling promoters didn't go. And in the summer of 1985, now this is all being reported by the Wrestling Observer, but Dave Meltzer usually had his facts pretty straight. According to the Wrestling Observer, in the summer of 1985, Vern Gagne realizes he's losing all of his wrestlers, and he has to do something. So the first thing that he decides he's going to do is he's going to get all of his wrestlers under contract. But in the letter that he sends the wrestlers with the contract, he tells them, this is a really great deal for you. I'm being more generous than I've ever been before. But under no circumstances are you to show this contract to an attorney or a lawyer. If you hand me a contract for anything, to buy a lawnmower, and you tell me after you hand it to me, for whatever you do, you cannot show this to an attorney, the first thing I'm going to do is take that contract and show it to an attorney. Because why would you not want me to show this contract to an attorney if everything is on the up and up? It really struck me of what a large gap there was between Vince the businessman and Vern Gagne the businessman, Jim Crockett the businessman, Fritz von Erich the businessman, even Bill Watts the businessman. Bill Watts was probably the best out of all of them, but even he was not thinking like Vince was thinking about cable is the next big thing. VHS is the next big thing. I need to be in the places that the people that are running these groups are and start talking their language and get them interested in my product. Even Bill Watts wasn't thinking like that. The other thing I didn't realize was how good WWF was doing in St. Louis in 1985 and how bad the traditional wrestling promotion in St. Louis under the leadership of Bob Geigel, Pat O'Connor, and Bulldog Bob Brown was doing. But when you look at those cards, because I thought that the last card that my sister and I attended was in 85, but actually it was in the summer of 1984. Really, the only match they have to draw fans in 1985 is Kerry versus Flair. And apparently one of the best Kerry versus Flair matches occurred in January of 1985 in St. Louis, but there was only 5,000 people there at the show. And that's one of the things that they ran into is you've only got Kerry and Flair to draw your crowd. And how many times had people seen that match? I'd probably seen 10 versions of that match by 1985 between world-class TV and them having the matches in St. Louis. The last card Vicky and I attended was Kerry versus Flair a month or two after he lost the title back to Flair. People had seen that match, but that match could still draw 4,000 or 5,000 people to a arena that they used to draw 9,000 to 10,000 people every 3 weeks on Friday night in the Kiel Auditorium. Now they're drawing between 2,000 and 4,000 fans. There was a card that they had in one of the winter months in 85 that drew less than 2,000 fans. I never thought that ever occurred in St. Louis. And then at the end of 85, Vince locks up the Kiel Auditorium with an exclusive agreement, and it forces the St. Louis Wrestling Club into the Checkerdome, which was far too expensive to run. So they get into a partnership with Jim Crockett, and Jim Crockett is willing to lose money for a little bit to run the Checkerdome or the arena. It was the Checkerdome, and Ralston Purina owned it. The rest of the time, the big arena in St. Louis was called the Arena. Again, Vince is a much, much better businessman than Bob Geigel, Pat O'Connor, and Bob Brown, and that's why he won the wrestling war. So for the main content this week, and I have a pretty full show here to hopefully make up for last week when I was even more under the weather than I am right now. And so for this week, I wanted to go back to the 20th century because next week we're going to be off for a week. But on the last show for January, I want to talk about Harry Hill, who I thought I had already talked about on the show, but it doesn't look like it, at least not for the last 4 or 5. But I wanted to talk about, because I don't think I've ever discussed this, was Stanislaus Zbyszko winning the World Championship in 1921. If I had discussed it at all, it was briefly about when I was discussing something else regarding Stanislaus Zbyszko, and it would have been quite a while ago. So I thought it was fair game to talk about and really talk about in depth this title switch, which this is a work match, so we're not talking about a shoot. This is 1921. So a shoot is a legitimate contest where the wrestlers are wrestling legitimately to try to defeat the other one. Working are prearranged exhibitions where both wrestlers have agreed to put on a good match, and they've already agreed on who the winner is going to be prior to this match. And so going into this match on May 6th, 1921, Ed Strangler Lewis is the current world heavyweight champion, and he had just won the belt from Joe Stecker in December of 1920. So he's only held the belt about 5 months. Stanislaus Zbyszko, a big name in the United States from 1909, late 1909, into early 1914, he was one of the competitors brought from Europe to take on Frank Gotch during Frank Gotch's dominant world title reign in the United States from 1908 to 1913. So fans were familiar with Stanislaus Zbyszko from his earlier time in the United States, but Zbyszko left the United States in frustration in 1914. Zbyszko came over to wrestle Frank Gotch in late 1909, and he and Gotch, I believe, worked a match that it was handicap stipulations. Gotch had to throw Zbyszko twice in 90 minutes or be considered the loser, and he couldn't throw Zbyszko once in the 90 minutes. But I think they were working that match to try to generate interest in the world title match, which was going to be a contest. And originally it had been planned for Memorial Day 1910, but the Chicago mayor would not issue a permit for them to wrestle on Memorial Day because he thought it would take people away from what he thought they should be doing, which was decorating the graves of their relatives who had died. So he issues the permit for June 1st, 1910, and Zbyszko and Gotch have their only wrestling match for the world title. And it was very controversial because of the tactics Gotch used, but there was never a rematch. Stanislaus Zbyszko stayed in the United States from June of 1910 until the summer of 1914, trying to secure a rematch with Frank Gotch, but Frank Gotch always had a excuse about why he wouldn't give Zbyszko a rematch. So you can say he was ducking Zbyszko, you were saying he just didn't want to be bothered with him anymore. Whatever the reasoning was, that is the only opponent who was a big money matchup still. Zbyszko was probably the biggest money matchup for Gotch, not named George Hackenschmidt. Gotch wanted nothing to do with him. Eventually, Gotch wrestles his last match in April of 1913. Zbyszko waits around a year and realizes Gotch is not coming out of retirement, so he returns to Europe because World War I has broken out, and he is going to join the Polish division of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in World War I. Again, I apologize for my voice this week. I'm probably 75% there, but I'm still not 100% yet. Back to what we were talking about. Zbyszko leaves the United States. He gets stuck over in Europe during World War I. He's a prisoner of war for a while. He has some run-ins with old foe Alex Aberg and George Lurich when he's in Russia. And he's still stuck in Europe as late as 1920, but he runs into a U.S. senator who is interested in Polish war relief. And because Zbyszko is also interested in Polish war relief and is willing to come back and wrestle some matches to raise money for Polish war relief, the senator arranges for Zbyszko to have a visa to come back to the United States. So in late 1920, Zbyszko, well, maybe the summer of 1920, Zbyszko comes back to the United States for the first time since the summer of 1914. And he is going to wrestle basically out of Jack Curley's office in New York because his brother Vladek is Jack Curley's biggest star at the time. And Stanislaus moves in with Vladek in New York. One of the things that Stanislaus picks up on right away is that while he wrestled almost all legitimate contests between 1909 and 1914, it is now a worked business. Almost all of the matches are prearranged. There are very few contests. Really, the only contests for the most part are matches to settle promotional wars where the promoters didn't trust each other to do it in a training match. They wanted to do it out in front of people. Or a wrestler tries to double-cross another wrestler and go against the prearranged finish and take the title legitimately, which happened quite a bit. Stanislaus Zbyszko was involved in one of the most famous in 1925. But Zbyszko comes back. He's preparing for his in-ring debut in 1920, 1921. And the old trustbuster, Marin Plastina, is still around. And Marin Plastina is still challenging everybody to a legitimate contest. Well, Stanislaus Zbyszko, not knowing that Jack Curley and the other members of the trust had been trying to freeze Plastina out and refused to let any of their wrestlers wrestle him, says, yeah, I'll go ahead and wrestle him. And is going to wrestle Plastina in New York in late 1920. Well, I don't know if Vladek smartened him up or if Jack Curley, but all of a sudden Stanislaus Zbyszko wasn't booked, and he realized, oh, that was a mistake. Now, the mistake was actually on Curley and Sandow's part. They should have let Stanislaus Zbyszko wrestle Plastina because he probably would have won, and that would have put an end to the pro wrestling war. So the wrestling war, or Plastina's insurgency, however you want to refer to it, lasted until November 1921 when Curley finally put Plastina up against John the Nebraska Tigerman Pesek. When Stanislaus Zbyszko backs out of the matches with Plastina, he is now back in good graces with the Curley promotion, and he starts wrestling some of the top stars like Earl Caddock and Joe Stecker. And Zbyszko surprisingly beats them. When Zbyszko came back to the United States, the war had definitely aged him. He was only 40, 41 years old. He was 40 when he came in 1920, and he was 41 when he wrestled this match against Ed Strangler Lewis. Zbyszko's birthday is in April of 1880. Zbyszko looks 50. He's 40, 41, but he looks 50. They don't want to say he's 50 because they're worried that that's too old. So they start billing him, Jack Curley and the other promoters, start billing him as the grand old man of wrestling and say he's 46 when he's only 40, 41 at the time. But he'll pass for 46. They decide that while Zbyszko is beating these top contenders and is becoming a top contender for Ed Strangler Lewis, the promoter, Jack Curley, and the manager, Billy Sandow, decide they need to cool off Ed Strangler Lewis because he's got this strangle. He's got the headlock over so well that the New York State Athletic Commission bans the use of the headlock in professional wrestling. This hold that's safe, it's really not a danger to anybody. If you put a headlock on somebody in grappling, you're asking for them to take your back and choke you out. This hold that's not dangerous at all, they ban this hold because Lewis has gotten this hold over so well in his matches where he disabled people and knocked them unconscious. After the New York State Athletic Commission bans the headlock and Lewis causes a riot in Kansas City by destroying his opponent with the headlock, they decide we need to cool this off. Lewis needs to drop the belt for a little bit. And they were fine with Lewis dropping the belt because if the person didn't want to play ball and give the belt back to Lewis, Lewis could just take it. Funny enough, one of the few people that he thought could beat him in a legitimate contest, even though he was 41 years old at the time, Lewis thought that only his training partner, Joseph Tootsmont, and Stanislaus Zbyszko, who wasn't really a hooker, he was just a very, very good wrestler. He was a shooter. He thought Zbyszko is one of the only two people that could beat him in a legitimate contest. But they decided to put the belt on Stanislaus Zbyszko, who one of his great frustrations in the United States was he was never able to win the world title from Frank Gotch when they were wrestling a contest. He did win a contest with Alex Aberg for the World Greco-Roman Heavyweight Wrestling Championship in 1914. Now, it's debatable whether that was actually the World Greco-Roman Wrestling Championship at the time, but he did have a victory over Aberg, which I don't know of anybody else who ever beat Aberg in Greco-Roman wrestling in the United States. I think that was only Stanislaus Zbyszko. Aberg beat Vladik a couple of times in Greco-Roman wrestling. But since they've decided they need to cool him off, now we need to put the belt on somebody. Lewis and Sandow, because of a professional rivalry with Joe Stecker, really didn't want Joe Stecker to have it back. And Earl Caddock is getting ready to retire. He's going to start focusing on his business interests and get out of professional wrestling. So they're left to choose between Vladik Zbyszko and Stanislaus Zbyszko. Jack Curley would find either one of them acceptable, but Billy Sandow and Ed Strangler Lewis much preferred Stanislaus Zbyszko. Even though Lewis knew that he could beat Vladik Zbyszko anytime he wanted to, they had a long-standing rivalry going back to their very first match in 1914 that devolved into a fist fight. In fact, the first 4 or 5 matches they wrestled, that were contests all devolved into fistfights because Lewis could not stand Vladik Zbyszko. Fall Guys by Marcus Griffin, which I've said is a problematic source. Great place to start your research, but you need to cross-check anything that you get out of that book. According to Marcus Griffin, Vladik Zbyszko was the only person that Ed Strangler Lewis ever shot on and put a actual submission hold on. Usually, if you made Ed Lewis mad and he was going to shoot on you, he punched you. Now, in a match, if he said, I tell you what, just let's wrestle, that meant he was going to beat you for real if you didn't go along with a program, which happened to Ed Don George in 1930. And Ed Don George, who was an Olympic wrestler, a very skilled amateur, and I believe collegiate wrestler, said, Ed, I could never beat you in a shoot. Let's just work. But according to the Fall Guys, he actually put a double arm wrist lock on Vladik Zbyszko and injured his shoulder in Rochester, New York in the early 1920s. I've never been able to find an account of that match. Hopefully one day I will. But right now I just have to say that tale is apocryphal because I cannot confirm that that's what happened. Ed Strangler Lewis and Billy Sandow had a strong dislike. Well, Billy Sandow did, and Ed Strangler Lewis did, and by extension, Billy Sandow probably didn't send Christmas cards to Vladik Zbyszko. So for their part, they would rather put over Stanislaus Zbyszko. Because of his reputation, because he won almost every single match from 1909 to 1914 when he was there the first time, and because he had victories over both Caddock and Stecker prior to wrestling Strangler Lewis in May of 1921, Jack Curley agrees and says, yeah, let's put the title on Stanislaus Zbyszko. Zbyszko would win that match on May 6th and become the world heavyweight champion for the first time. And he would hold that title until March of 1922. Now, one of the myths around Stanislaus Zbyszko's title reign was that it didn't draw money. That is not true at all. Stanislaus Zbyszko wrestled full houses against Ed Strangler Lewis, against Joe Stecker. The big-name wrestlers at the time, when he wrestled them, they drew big money. He drew well all over, particularly New York. It was just Strangler Lewis and Billy Sandow wanted the belt back in 1922. And because they were billing Stanislaus Zbyszko as 46, so now he's 47, you can't have your world champion running around claiming he's 50 years old. So the window for Stanislaus Zbyszko to be world champion was going to be short just because of how they marketed him and how old they said he was. But on this match, Ed Strangler Lewis wrestled Stanislaus Zbyszko at the 22nd Regiment Armory. And these were actually the typical venues for Jack Curley's matches at the time. He did not promote at Madison Square Garden all that often because the building was more expensive to run and he wasn't drawing 20,000 people to the wrestling matches. This card, which was a full house, drew 7,500 fans. He would also use the 71st Street Regiment Armory, and there was one other armory around New York City that were the normal venue for Curley's cards. If he put on an extravaganza, he might try to get Madison Square Garden, but for the most part, he would promote at the regimental armories. In fact, when William Muldoon wanted to squeeze Curley's operation in the late 1920s, early 1930s, he did so by going after Curley's leases with the regimental armories. He went so far as to go to the commandant of the New York State National Guard and get him to rescind permission for Curley to use those regimental armories for his cards. So for a while, Curley, through other people, because Muldoon was also trying to pull his promotional license, he was booking and promoting through intermediaries, and they were going to opera houses and theaters and things like that because he couldn't get the regimental armories anymore. But in 1921, he's still able to, and they draw a full house. Now, At the time, most world title matches went between 1.5 to 3 hours. That was the norm. And a lot of them were 2 out of 3 fall matches that would go 2 to 3 hours. And a lot of it is because betting was still going on and they're trying to generate bets on the wrestlers. Not just who was going to win, but who would win the first fall, who would win the fastest fall. These were all the kind of things that they would bet on. A lot of times the outcome of the match was manipulated to maximize their gambling winnings. This match surprised the fans because it only lasted 23 minutes and 17 seconds. For this match, they made the title win look kind of fluky. They probably thought that if this doesn't go well, we'll just have Ed take it back in, 4 to 6 months. It was almost a year before they took it back, which also belies the financial success that Zbyszko's title reign was. It did draw money. Zbyszko is considered a heavy underdog, so hence they probably made a killing on the bets too. Lewis weighs 237 pounds for this bout. Zbyszko weighs 226, which was on the low end for Zbyszko. Zbyszko normally weighed anywhere between 225 and 260. And for most of his career, I'd say 245 to 250 was about where he weighed in at. And right away, Lewis comes out of his corner and he's pressing the attack. He secures a body hold after only 4 minutes on Zbyszko, but Zbyszko is able to break it. Zbyszko crawls to the ropes 3 times to break other holds that Lewis puts on him. And of course, Lewis is going for the headlock quite a bit. And at one point, he gets a toe hold on Zbyszko. Zbyszko wrestled barefoot. And as a rule, the wrestlers wanted the other wrestler to wear shoes because it's harder to slip your foot out when you've got a boot on than when your leg is sweaty. Remember, this is a work, so they're not actually going to be putting on legitimate toe holds. But when Gotch wrestled Zbyszko in 1910, he was not happy that Zbyszko always wrestled barefoot and wanted him to wear boots. Now, since Lewis didn't normally wear boots either, this was just 2 barefoot wrestlers going against each other. Lewis put a toe hold on Zbyszko that he held on for 1 minute and 30 seconds before Zbyszko was able to break it. If this had been a shoot toe hold and Lewis had sunk it in, an hour or 1 minute and 30 seconds would have been more than enough to tear the ligaments in his ankles. So these guys are working. Another key that you know that they're working is they're moving very fast between holds. So Lewis moves and puts a head scissors on Zbyszko. Zbyszko escapes the head scissors, and Lewis goes for the headlock. And Zbyszko pushes off the first 2 attempts, which Lewis is, in air quotes, frustrated and jumps at Zbyszko trying to secure a flying headlock, and his feet slip out from underneath him and he falls prone to the mat. As soon as he falls prone to the mat, Zbyszko follows him down, puts a neck crank on him to put pressure on his neck as he pushes down on his chest, and Zbyszko pins him at 23 minutes, 17 seconds for the 1 fall match, and Zbyszko is the new world heavyweight champion. The quick end to that match shocked the fans who just sat there quiet for a couple of minutes, and then they started applauding wildly because Lewis a lot of times played the heel in his matches, and in this match he was the heel as well. I don't know how long they intended to keep the title on him, but he held the title until March of 1922. And at that point, he dropped the title back to Lewis, and Lewis was prepared for it to have to go to a shoot if necessary, but it didn't. Zbyszko cooperated with him and dropped it back. This was the main event of a 3-match card. So underneath that was the co-main event, which was Ivan Lenow, the Russian Lion, versus Halmar Johnson, who was a Brooklyn heavyweight. And Lanao beat Johnson after 34 minutes, 20 seconds with a double arm wrist lock and leg scissors combination. In 1921, Ivan Lanao is almost a part-time wrestler because he's found work in both silent and eventually talking pictures 10 years later, but he's found work in silent films. And he often played a character actor in silent films before transitioning to sound films. Lanao was one of the wrestlers who died young. He was only 52. He had retired from acting 2 years earlier, and he had a massive heart attack. The opening match saw George Farmer Bailey, who was a local product from Brattleboro, Vermont. He was a full-time farmer, part-time wrestler, and he goes back all the way to the 1908, 1909 is when he made his debut, and he wrestled up into the 20s. And because he was a Northeastern wrestler, whenever they needed a guy for the card, he would often get the call. And he wrestled another Polish wrestler because Stanislaus Zbyszko is Polish. Stanley Stasek. George Farmer Bailey wrestled him in the opener, and they went to a draw, basically warming the crowd up for the co-main event and the main event. So that is the Jack Curley card from May 6th, 1921. My recommendation for this week, I only have one, and it's a wrestling match that's on YouTube. And again, there's always links at the show notes at kenzermanjr.com/episode 117. But the match I'm recommending is Vern Gagne versus Roy McClarty. I've heard Roy McClarty's name a lot on the Guest the Program portion of Jim Cornette's podcast that he does with Brian Last. So I'm going back and looking at some of these classic wrestlers from the 40s and 50s. And McClarty is a Canadian wrestler who is kind of a babyface. I think, well, not kind of a babyface. He is a babyface. And he's wrestling Vern Gagne, who's definitely a babyface in the Chicago promotion in the 1950s. And it may turn you off to watch a babyface versus babyface match, but these are the things I grew up on in St. Louis. In St. Louis, we definitely had baby faces and heels. Nobody liked Bulldog Bob Brown. But it was not unusual because Sam always treated it like a sport. You could have bad guys wrestle each other occasionally, and you would have good guys wrestle each other occasionally. The Missouri Heavyweight Championship in 1978 changed hands from Jack Briscoe to Kevin Von Erich in St. Louis in a straight babyface versus babyface match. You wouldn't think that odd if you grew up in St. Louis. If you grew up in Memphis wrestling, that would be extremely odd. The baby faces normally didn't wrestle each other. But I found the match to be pretty entertaining. A lot of wrestling in this one. It goes about 30 minutes, and I think it was 1952, but it could have been 1954. So that's my recommendation this week, and I'll have a link in the show notes. And then for my review this week, I watched a Southeastern Championship wrestling show from December 22nd, 1984. And this is the Ron Fuller promotion that really covered southern Alabama and northern Florida after the Knoxville War of 1979, when Ron Fuller sold that part of the promotion. He had already bought Gulf Coast from, I think it was family members, because the Fields owned some of that territory, and probably some of the Welches owned parts of that territory too. And Ron Fuller bought it and ran that until I think 85, 86. I think the promotion existed at least till 1988, but I think the Fullers sold it before that. And so Southeastern Championship Wrestling was a complete black hole to me in the 1980s because obviously I didn't get the TV being in St. Louis. They weren't on any cable stations, although I believe right before they shut down, I think they got cable, because it seems to me I remember a couple of their shows from like 88, but you didn't even get coverage of Southeastern Championship Wrestling in the magazines. They kind of did their own thing. It wasn't because they were not successful. They were actually fairly successful, and a lot of people liked working there because they were short trips. You didn't have the crazy mileage you'd have to drive if you were like in Mid-South or AWA. It was in Calgary. It was short trips, fairly consistent towns. So it was not like they weren't a successful promotion, but they were just in their corner of the world doing their own thing, and you saw very little coverage of them in the magazines. And you didn't, their show didn't have any penetration outside of their local area until, like I said, just about the time they were getting ready to shut down. One of the things that I noticed right away was the announcers were Charlie Platt, who I'd never heard before, and Rick Stewart. Now, I knew Rick Stewart because Rick Stewart was the Central States announcer in 1986, and he may have come up in 1985 because I think Ron Fuller sold the promotion in late 85, which would make sense that Rick Stewart would come to Central States. But Rick Stewart was the regular announcer in Central States definitely for 1986 because he was also on Starrcade 1986. Jim Crockett bought Central States Wrestling right before Starrcade 1986 because Kansas City had been dead for several years and they had managed to kill St. Louis. So Crockett bought a couple of their TV, their TV spots, and he didn't take hardly any of their wrestlers, and you wouldn't have. There was nobody in Central States that was going to make a big impact in Mid-Atlantic. Rufus R. Jones had been in Mid-Atlantic, but he'd been there a couple years before, and Rufus was starting to get up there in age. There was nobody else in Central States I think he was really interested in. Scott Hall had already gone to AWA. Marty Jannetty, I think, had already gone to AWA. Everybody else was a homesteader. So they weren't going to bring Akio Sato and Bulldog Bob Brown to the Carolinas for those cards. So Charlie Platt and Rick Stewart are the announcers, and Rick Stewart is also the ring announcer. And the show starts with a preview of the show that's interrupted about 1 minute in by the new Southeastern champion Jimmy Golden, cousin to Ron and Robert Fuller. Golden had just beaten the former champion Austin Idol. Austin Idol was one of the mainstay baby faces of this territory. And Jimmy Golden, because of his family connection, was a big heel performer in Southeastern Championship Wrestling. And you probably saw him as Bunkhouse Buck in the 1990s in WCW, if you're familiar with him at all. But he was a heck of a worker. He was really good. And Ron Fuller is his manager. Now, it threw me off because Ron Fuller is doing that exact same managerial shtick that his brother Robert was doing in WCW. And they look enough alike. At first, I thought that was Robert Fuller, but then Robert Fuller came out a little bit later, and I'm like, oh, that was Ron. Between the look and everything, he was indistinguishable from his brother Robert in WCW. Robert Fuller was also the booker for his brother Ron's promotion. All of this was hidden from the fans. The fans did not know Ron Fuller owned the promotion. They didn't know Robert Fuller was the booker. They did know Jimmy Golden was their cousin because that had been talked about for years on the shows before they were even owners of any territory. When Ron was a wrestler for a number of years, late 60s, early 70s. And then in 74, he bought Knoxville, and I think he might have been 26 or 27 time. He was the youngest promoter in the NWA. And then in 77 or 78, he bought Gulf Coast, and that was like Southeastern, but it was Southeastern South. They were going to have a Northern Circuit and a Southern Circuit. But then a number of the wrestlers tried to go outlaw in 1979, and it destroyed that Knoxville end of the promotion. The Raging Bull Randy Barber versus Mr. Olympia is the opening match. And Mr. Olympia is Jerry Stubbs. Now, the fans at this point in time know Olympia is Jerry Stubbs, but Jerry Stubbs is one of those mask wrestlers that the mask really helped him. It gave him he always had $1 million physique, but he looked older than he was, and he was kind of going bald early. premature balding. Well, that mask covered that up, and when you got the physique in the mask, he looked like Superman. If he had the mask off, he looked like your uncle that worked out. So I think he's one of the cases. Another one is Mr. Wrestling 2, who they said looked like nothing without the mask, but you put the mask on him, and he looked a lot better. Olympia gave him a lot of this match, which threw me, but you could tell by the way the announcers were talking that they had plans to push Randy Barber, although I don't know why, because he looked like the guy that would service your car more than he looked like a professional wrestler. But I will say that this is before Vince really turned the business into a physique business. A lot of the people besides Jerry Stubbs as Mr. Olympia did not have the greatest physiques in the world. Jimmy Golden was always in great shape. Not super muscular, but, looked like an athlete. And then Robert Fuller comes out and announces that he's going to go into semi-retirement. Ron had already pretty much gone into retirement. He would come out occasionally, but his knees were so bad from basketball and his time in the ring that Ron was already retired and Robert was going into semi-retirement. He did stay semi-retired. Every great once in a while, you would get the Tennessee stud Robert Fuller in the ring, but for the most part, he started winding his wrestling career down in the mid-'80s. They went to local promos, which were hyping the December 26, 1984 card in Montgomery, Alabama. And the card featured 2 cage matches, including a rematch between the Southern champion Jimmy Golden versus the former champion Austin Idol. And then the second match was a rematch between Jimmy Golden and Austin Idol. That was one of those where, well, they had signed for it previously, and Jimmy Golden was stuck defending, or he was going to be stripped of the title. But, they normally didn't give those matches away on TV, and they didn't give this one away either. The match went about 30 seconds before Ron Fuller interfered, and the referee DQ'd Golden when, championships can't change hands on a disqualification. And then the stud stable attacked Idol and left him bleeding from the mouth. They did the thing where you hit the person in the throat with a stick or a chair or what. Well, this time it was Ron Fuller's cane. Of course, that's going to bring out Ron Fuller, or not Ron Fuller, Robert Fuller, who has just said that he was going to step away from the ring. But he says he can't do that with Austin Idol injured, and he's going to step in and wrestle Jimmy Golden for Austin Idol at the next big card. In between all of that, they have an individual come out named Bill Ash, who is complaining that the junior heavyweight title shot with Denny Brown, the NWA junior heavyweight champion, is going to Scott Armstrong. At one time when Danny Hodge and Leroy McGirt held the junior heavyweight champion, that was an important championship. I'd even say when Jerry Briscoe held it, it still had a little bit of prestige to it. When you got down to the point where Mike Davis and Denny Brown were wrestling for the title, it had lost most of its luster, and I think Leroy had quit booking it a long time before then. And it was just another championship in the NWA. Bill Ash is one of the most unimpressive looking individuals I've ever seen in my life physically, but he would pass for a junior heavyweight, and this was to further their feud. So the card had like 3 matches on it. Not a whole lot happened other than the angles, and that's the way a lot of local TV ran. You can see this one is running more like a Memphis card than a St. Louis card. So that was my review for this week. There'll be a link for that show that's on YouTube in the show notes at kenzermanjr.com, episode 117. We're going to be taking a break next week for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day here in the United States. But we'll be back on January 26th with a new episode. And that one I'm going to discuss Harry Hill's contribution to professional wrestling in the 19th century and to sports in New York in general. In February, one of the shows is going to be on Jack Claiborne, who was one of the early African American wrestlers in the United States, and he happens to have Missouri ties because he was born in Moberly, Missouri, and got his start wrestling in that area and around Missouri before going out into the United States. So that'll be it for this week's show. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've not had a chance, if you could rate this show on iTunes or wherever you listen to it, I would greatly appreciate it. That helps to keep the show visible, and it also helps people that have never heard of the show find it. KinzermanJr.com is my website, and that's the place to find things that I've worked on in the past, books I'm writing, and books that I'll be writing in the future. You can always ask me a question or send me a comment at ken@kinzermanjr.com. I'd love to hear from you, and I love to get questions. Until 2 weeks from now, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.